Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight we're venturing deep into the haunted heart of Texas, where the wide-open landscapes and forgotten towns hide unspeakable horrors. From ghostly figures stalking abandoned mills to blood-red lakes that hunger for the living. We're bringing you 5 of the most terrifying Texas horror stories that will make you question what truly lingers under that vast Lone Star sky. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And because of that, they miss out on the darkest, most bone-chilling stories that only the true horror fans get to. Here, don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's only the beginning and the shadows of Texas have so much more to reveal. So, where are you watching from? And tell me, what time is it there? Because here, the night is just waking up and the terror is ready to unfold. Let's get started. It was just a stretch of cracked asphalt running through the East Texas pines, a forgotten road that led nowhere. The locals called it Hollow Road, and even in daylight, the air there felt dense, stagnant. Like breathing through wool, nobody used the road anymore. It wasn't marked on any maps, and even the trucks that cut through the backwoods preferred longer routes. Not since the accident. Not since the rain-soaked night Sheriff Wilkins found those bodies tangled like driftwood in the creek. They were kids from the high school. 5 of them packed into a rusted Buick for a night of cheap whiskey and bad decisions. They said the driver swerved to avoid something in the road, a deer, maybe, or a dog. But the skid marks were wrong, twisted, like something had yanked the car sideways. The parents mourned, the town forgot, and the pines grew thicker, roots creeping over the old asphalt like skeletal fingers. But Hollow Road didn't stay quiet. It was mostly drifters who vanished first. The sort of people nobody came looking for. An out-of-state hiker whose campsite was found shredded to ribbons. A hunter who stumbled out of the woods half-starved, rambling about voices that whispered through the leaves. His hair had gone white, his eyes dull as river stones. He died in his sleep 3 days later. Then it started coming for the town's own. An old woman was found hanging from a tree, her neck swaddled in barbed wire like some hellish scarf. Teenagers dared each other to spend a night by the road and came back hollow-eyed, feverish, their skin laced with scratches they couldn't explain. One of them, a girl named Lindsay, disappeared entirely. Her mother swore she could hear her daughter's voice calling from the woods at night, a sing-song plea that echoed beneath her floorboards. Sheriff Wilkins made the mistake of going back, said he was investigating a noise complaint, but everyone knew he was chasing ghosts. When he came stumbling out of the woods 3 days later, his uniform was soaked in blood that wasn't his own. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't even open his eyes, just sat there in his kitchen, mumbling nursery rhymes until his tongue went dry. But it was the Higgins family that broke the town's back. They'd bought a plot of land near the old road, planning to build a farmhouse. A new start, Mr. Higgins called it. His wife Anna hadn't wanted to move, but the cheap land and her husband's stubbornness made the decision for her. They had a daughter, Emily, bright-eyed, cheerful, a little girl with a laugh like chimes. They moved in during the fall. By winter, Anna was gone. Mr. Higgins claimed she'd left him, run off with some salesmen passing through town, but the folks who knew Anna doubted it. She was a steady woman, rooted deep like the old oaks around her property. Emily stopped speaking not long after. She would sit on the porch for hours, staring into the woods with glassy eyes. Her tiny hands clenched so tight her knuckles turned white. Mr. Higgins tried to get her to talk, to eat, to sleep. Nothing worked. The night he brought her into town, Emily finally broke her silence. She whispered to the doctor that her mother was calling to her from the trees, that her voice echoed through the dark like a song, sweet and gentle. "I have to go," she told him, her voice trembling. "Mama's waiting." Mr. Higgins locked the doors that night, pushed furniture against the windows, sat awake in his rocking chair with a rifle across his lap. It didn't matter. By dawn, Emily was gone. The search lasted 2 weeks. They found scraps of her nightdress snagged on thorn bushes, little footprints pressed into the mud, but nothing else. No body. No sign of struggle. It was as if the woods had swallowed her whole. Mr. Higgins hung himself in the barn a week later. Sheriff Wilkins quit the force after that, sold his house, moved to Houston, and never looked back. The fence they put up around Hollow Road rusted over the years, but no one dared cross it. Even now, the air near the road feels thick, wrong, and on cold nights when the moon is low, you can still hear Emily's voice drifting through the pines, soft and broken. She's still looking for her mother. Or worse, something is calling her name, something that waits beyond the Hollow Road. Years passed. The road stayed quiet, but Hollow Road had a way of calling people back. The old town had shrunk by then, businesses drying up like corpses left too long in the sun. Folks moved away, chased by hunger or fear, or both. The gas station went dark, the school closed its doors, and even the sheriff's office was boarded up. Hollow Road became a scar nobody wanted to touch, but the land didn't forget. Annie Wilkins returned to town on a cold November night, her headlights slicing through the fog like knives. She hadn't planned to come back. Not really. But her father's death had dragged her home. The old farmhouse now nothing more than rot and splinters. But it wasn't just grief that drew her back. It was the dreams. The same dream, night after night. Hollow Road stretching out before her, its cracks slick with blood. Voices whispering from the trees, tugging at her mind like barbed hooks. She woke each morning with scratches on her arms and legs like she'd been running through bramble and thorn. And always, at the end of the dream, Emily Higgins's face, hollow-eyed, screaming. Annie couldn't ignore it anymore. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. So she returned. And when she finally reached the rusted gate that sealed off Hollow Road, she found the locks broken, fresh footprints pressed into the mud. Someone else had gone looking, or something had finally gotten out. The Shiner Cotton Mill had died slowly, long before the fire, before the tragedy everyone whispered about but rarely mentioned outright, as if speaking the words would invite something terrible back into their lives. It had once been the largest employer in town, a sprawling complex of red brick buildings and iron railings, their bones still visible through the encroaching tangle of kudzu and thorny mesquite. Generations of families worked the looms and spinning machines, their days stitched together by the steady clatter of machinery. Children grew old and had children of their own, all of them drawn to the mill like moths to a flickering light. Then came the accidents. Fingers caught in gears, hair torn from scalps. The mill's appetite for blood grew sharper, hungrier. Superstitions took root. Workers swore they saw faces peering from the shadows between the great looms, heard voices threaded between the mechanical groans. The fire happened on a bitterly cold night in January of 1954. It began in the southern wing where the dye vats were kept. The cause was never confirmed, but the story the town told was this. A man named Roy Carver, drunk and bleary-eyed, had taken a lantern to the storage room to search for a misplaced wrench. Something happened. A fall, a stumble, an accident. The lamp shattered. Flames spread fast, swallowing cotton like dry grass. Within minutes, the whole wing was an inferno. Roy Carver died along with 17 others. His body was never found, but something of him remained. Something the town tried hard to forget. They shut the mill down for good 2 years later. It was too expensive to repair, the owners said, but everyone knew it was something else. The place had soured. The air around the ruins felt thick and oily, like a fevered breath. In the years that followed, the mill became a proving ground for the town's teenagers. Boys dared each other to spend a night within the crumbling walls. Girls told tales of ghostly apparitions that appeared in the broken windows, but none of them stayed for long. The bravest rarely lasted more than an hour. The mill didn't like visitors. Jacob Carter was one of those brave ones, a 15-year-old with a beer buzz and a grudge against the world. He and his friends had come to the mill one October night, flashlights jittering in the darkness as they crept through the buckling corridors. They laughed and shoved each other, trying to mask their nerves. The air was still, choked with the smell of rot and old oil. But there was something else, too. A sharper scent that clung to the back of their throats like bile, burning fabric. The others joked and made crude gestures at the graffiti tagged walls. But Jacob felt something wrong beneath his feet, a trembling, almost imperceptible, like the vibrations of a train in the distance. "Feel that?" he asked. "What?" His friend Mark snorted. "The shakes from all the booze you guzzled?" "No, it's the floor. It's moving." "Dude, you're full of shit." Jacob didn't argue. He just kept walking, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. As they pushed deeper into the ruins, the sound of machinery began to swell, a low, grumbling hum like a great engine waking up after a long sleep. "That's... what the fuck is that?" Mark said, his voice fraying at the edges. "I thought this place was dead." Jacob's flashlight trembled in his grip. "That's just the wind, man," said Corey, the biggest and dumbest of their group. "Old places make noises." But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder, layers piling upon each other. The rattling of chains, the clattering of gears, the hiss of steam. And over it all, the wet, dragging footsteps. They heard it before they saw anything. A sloshy, dragging scrape, like boots soaked in blood and mud being hauled across stone. Jacob's chest tightened. His eyes scanned the blackened hallways, the shadowed alcoves where light dared not reach. "Fuck this," Mark said. "I'm going back." "Chicken shit," Corey muttered, but his eyes were wide and twitchy. The air turned icy, not just cool, but arctic. Each breath burned Jacob's lungs. That's when he saw the figure. It stood at the end of the hall, draped in a tattered cloak made of stitched burlap. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but something about the way it tilted its head made Jacob's skin prickle. The fabric twitched and shifted as if alive, or as if something beneath it was writhing to get free. The others saw it too. Corey swore and stumbled backward. Mark let out a high-pitched wail. Jacob's flashlight flickered, and for a heartbeat, the figure moved. Not walked, moved. It slid forward with that sickening, wet drag like something, pushing itself along with shattered legs. Jacob turned and ran, his heartbeat a roaring thing in his ears. He felt fingers brush his neck, light, icy, sharp as needles. He screamed, his feet pounding against the cracked concrete. They didn't stop running until they were back in the empty field outside the mill. Corey was crying. Mark was babbling about the fucking thing and how it reached for him. But Jacob couldn't speak. He just kept looking back at the mill, at the gaping doorway where something still moved, its wet footsteps dragging through the dust. He never went back. None of them did. But the stories spread. Of the shadowy figure that lurked the corridors, its face hidden beneath the burlap hood. Of the burning scent that never faded. They say Roy Carver never left. Or maybe it wasn't Roy at all. Maybe the mill had birthed something new that night, something hungry. Nacogdoches is an old town, the kind of place where roots grow deep and tangled like secrets buried beneath mud and pine needles. People there have long memories. They remember old feuds and stranger things, stories passed down through gritted teeth and nervous laughter. But even in a town that prides itself on tradition and storytelling, the Mannequin House is something no one likes to talk about. The house itself is barely more than a skeleton now, crumbling into the Texas soil like an animal left to rot. The roof had caved in decades ago, sections of it eaten away by rot and termites. Windows shattered by stone-throwing kids or storm-blown branches leave jagged holes in the darkened facade. But the mannequins remain. They're all over the house, scattered through rooms as if dropped from the sky and frozen mid-motion. Limbless, torsos propped against door frames, heads perched on the broken remnants of tables, glass eyes catching the light with an eerie, almost sentient glint. Nobody knows who put them there or when. Most agree it happened long after the original owners fled. But whether it was squatters, vandals, or some deranged artist, no one can say. They're made of plastic and wood, their joints rough and cracked. But their faces, God, Their faces are lifelike, more than they should be, and sometimes people swear they move. The first time Robbie Denton saw the house, he was 13, skinny as a rail and full of bad ideas. His older brother Kyle had brought him along with a few other high school kids for a night of stupid dares and cheap beer. "Just gotta go in," Kyle said, slapping him on the back. "Take a selfie with one of the mannequins. Come back out and you're good. Easy, right?" The others laughed, their voices already thick with alcohol. Robbie felt his cheeks flush, partly from embarrassment and partly from the unshakable sense of being watched. He swallowed his fear and pushed through the crooked door. The air inside was stagnant and cold, carrying a mildew tang that clung to the back of his throat. Dust coated the floor like a layer of dead skin, but worse than the smell was the silence. It was the kind of quiet that swallowed sound, leaving only the faint creak of settling wood and the occasional rustle of leaves brushing against broken glass. And then there were the mannequins. They were posed as if caught mid-task. A woman-shaped figure cradling a rusted saucepan in the kitchen. A headless body seated at a dining room table, its hands, 3 hands, arranged before it like utensils. A child-sized mannequin standing on the stairs, arms reaching towards something only it could see. He found himself staring at them longer than he should have, his eyes searching for some sign of movement, for a blink, a twitch. Just the wind, he told himself. Just your brain playing tricks. But the worst was in the parlor. A man-shaped mannequin dressed in a torn tuxedo stood before the fireplace, its head turned at a sickening angle. Its arms were bent upward, hands outstretched as if pleading with someone unseen. Robbie's breath hitched. For a moment, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper. The others outside were shouting at him, but their voices sounded thin, hollow, distant. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he snapped a picture of the mannequin. Its glass eyes caught the light, seeming to burn with a sharp, predatory intensity, and then he ran. He never told Kyle about the whisper, or the way the mannequin's arms seemed to shift as he left the room. He didn't mention the feverish dreams that haunted him for weeks afterward, nightmares of stiff plastic fingers raking against his skin. But Robbie couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. 2 weeks later, he came home from school to find a mannequin standing on his porch. It was small, child-sized, with arms stretched out like a hug. Kyle laughed it off. "Pranksters," he said. "Maybe one of the guys from the house." Robbie tried to believe him, but when he looked into those glass eyes, he saw something else. They got rid of it, tossed it in a ravine off Route 204. But the nightmares only grew worse. Robbie would wake in the dark, his skin crawling, sure he heard the faint creak of wood against tile. 2 days after his 16th birthday, Robbie found another mannequin waiting outside his bedroom window. This one had a hand pressed to the glass, its head tilted at an inquisitive angle, as if listening. That night, Robbie's mother woke to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp raps, followed by the scrape of something heavy being dragged. She opened the door to find Robbie standing in the hallway, eyes wide and unfocused. His hands were trembling. "It wants in," he whispered. "It just wants in." The mannequins came more frequently after that, sometimes left on the lawn, sometimes half buried in the dirt. They always looked the same, their glass eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was too sharp, too eager. They kept moving, kept knocking, kept waiting. No one's seen Robbie in years. His parents left town after the last incident, their eyes hollow and their words clipped. But the mannequins are still there. Sometimes hikers come across them in the woods, dressed in new clothes posed with unnatural grace. And every once in a while, one of them will end up on someone's porch. They say if you find a mannequin waiting for you, fingers poised as if knocking, you have only 2 choices. You can let it in, or you can run. But it's always going to find you. There are places where the air itself feels sick. Wichita Falls has its share of broken dreams and hollowed-out towns, but the place they call Blood Lake is something else entirely. It's not a large body of water, barely the size of a football field, nestled among thickets of live oaks and dense underbrush. No road signs point to it. No tourists ever stop by to snap pictures. Most of the locals pretend it doesn't exist, which is easier than it sounds. But everyone in Wichita Falls knows about the lake. They know it the way children know not to stick their hands in the mouths of stray dogs. They say the water turns red sometimes. Not a muddy brown or a rust-tainted crimson, but blood red, thick and shimmering under the moonlight. And they say it's been that way for generations. Back in 1931, 5 men tried to drain the lake. All of them local toughs, their mouths full of liquor and big talk. They brought pumps, shovels, and enough dynamite to shake the bones of the earth. Only 2 of them came back. They were found stumbling through the woods, eyes vacant and tongues shredded by their own teeth. One of them, a man named Otis Clemens, died the next day in a fit of fevered screaming. The other, Earl Baskin, was never the same. Spent the last years of his life babbling about faces in the water and how they watched him through the darkness. The authorities chalked it up to bad moonshine, madness, or a combination of both. But the locals knew better. Blood Lake had never been friendly, and it had never been empty. Decades later, kids from the high school began daring each other to swim there on hot summer nights. The kind of stupid, reckless fun that comes with youth. Hank Sturgis was 17 when he accepted the dare. Tall and gangly, with a mouth full of braces and a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas. "Just take a dip," his friend Benny said. "In and out, easy as hell." Hank snorted. "You think I'm scared of a damn puddle?" They stood on the shore, the moon swollen and yellow in the night sky. The water looked almost black, its surface calm and glassy. Hank had heard the stories. About how the lake went red sometimes, about how the locals whispered prayers whenever they drove past it. He didn't believe a word of it. He stripped down to his boxers and waded into the cold water. Mud squished between his toes, the chill biting at his skin. The others laughed and hollered from the shore, their voices distorted by distance and cheap whiskey. It was when the water reached his waist that he felt something brush against his leg. He jerked backward, splashing noisily. "Shit, there's something in here." "Just fish, man," Benny yelled, his grin a white crescent in the dark. "Probably catfish." But Hank knew the difference between a fish and something else. He swallowed his nerves and pushed forward, letting the water swallow him up to his chest. "See?" he shouted, forcing bravado into his voice. "I told you." The pain hit him like a razor dragged across his thigh. Hot and sharp and deep. He screamed, his arms flailing as he tried to make it back to the shore. His friends rushed forward, their laughter evaporating into shrieks of panic. They hauled him out of the water, blood streaming from a gash that ran from his knee to his hip. "I told you," Hank panted, his eyes wild. "Something's in there." They drove him to the hospital where he received 32 stitches and a lifetime's worth of nightmares. But Hank was one of the lucky ones. Others went missing. Laura Price, a girl from the high school cheer squad, decided to take the dare the following year. The boys had egged her on, teasing her about being afraid of a silly little pond. She never came out. They searched the lake for days, boats combing the water, divers scouring the murky depths. But there was nothing. Not even a scrap of fabric. Just that damned water, rippling like something beneath it was breathing. The divers reported feeling watched, their air tanks heavy and oppressive as if the lake itself were pressing down on them. One of them claimed to see faces below, contorted, desperate, their eyes wide and mouths stretched open in silent screams. The authorities dismissed it, called it exhaustion, hallucinations brought on by stress, but the locals knew better. "Lakes, hungry?" old Mrs. Talbot said. She was one of the few who would still talk about it. And when it gets hungry, it takes what it needs. Kids still dared each other to swim in Blood Lake, but fewer and fewer accepted. Those who did would return with scratches, bruises, the occasional broken bone, and sometimes they wouldn't return at all, and sometimes they wouldn't return at all. Hank Sturgis grew up, moved out of town, and tried to bury the memories. But the dreams followed him. He could still feel those cold, grasping hands pulling him under, the searing pain as something sliced into his flesh. He kept a map pinned to the wall of his apartment, the spot where Blood Lake lay circled in red ink. No matter how far he went, His eyes would always drift back to that spot. The last time anyone saw him, he was driving west in the dead of night, his eyes glazed and his hands trembling. Weeks later, his car was found abandoned on the edge of the lake. The driver's side door stood open, his footprints leading down to the shore. The water was calm that night, the surface placid and black. But the locals knew it wouldn't stay that way. Sooner or later, the lake would turn red again. It always did. The Chisos Mountains rise from the scrubland like a scarred fist, their jagged peaks stabbing at the sky. To most, they're just another part of Big Bend's rugged beauty. Endless trails winding through canyons and valleys, the air sharp with the scent of cedar and wildflowers. But locals know better than to wander too deep into those woods. They know about the screeching cabin. Its true name is lost to time, just a nameless shack built by a man whose sanity bled away long before his body gave out. Folks say he was a trapper, maybe a prospector, back when the land was more wild than it is now. A man named Jeremiah Crow. Crow wasn't well liked. Too many stories of him shooting at travelers who strayed too close, of him walking into town filthy and wild-eyed, his pockets stuffed with rusty nails and bloody pelts. They say he built the cabin himself, high in the Chisos, where the wind cuts like broken glass and the nights bleed pitch black. For a while he lived alone, his only company the distant yips of coyotes and the hooting of owls. Then the noises started. It was early spring when Jeremiah first heard the sound. A screeching, like nothing he'd ever heard before. Part animal, part metal, like iron claws scraping across slate. It echoed through the darkness, drawing closer with each passing night. He took to carving symbols into the cabin walls, crude marks gouged with knife and claw hammer, circles and crosses, jagged lines tangled together like thorny roots. He muttered, words too, fragments of prayers he half remembered from childhood sermons. But the noises didn't stop. They got worse. The screeching came from all sides, battering the cabin until the wood shivered in its joints. Some nights it sounded like something was digging, claws tearing at the earth beneath the floorboards. Other times it came from the roof, a relentless scraping like fingernails dragged across rotting shingles. The locals saw Jeremiah less, and less when he did come to town. He looked gaunt, his eyes sunken and raw. He bought tools, chisels and saws and sharpened blades, but no food. He told old man Gutierrez, the storekeeper, that something was trying to get in. What kind of something? Gutierrez had asked, a smirk on his lips. He didn't believe in nonsense, the kind that don't sleep, Crow whispered, the kind that don't bleed. A few months later, the noises stopped. So did Jeremiah Crow. Hunters stumbled upon the cabin a year later. The door hung open like a broken jaw, the wood scarred and splintered. Inside, the symbols had multiplied, etched into every inch of the walls and ceiling. The floor was torn, up planks ripped apart like shattered ribs. They found Jeremiah's body in the crawl space, his fingers worn down to the bone. He'd tried to scratch his way through the earth, his face twisted in terror, his lips stained with blood. The coroner called it madness, but the locals knew better. They buried him in a shallow grave outside the cabin, leaving a crude marker and little else. Over time, most forgot about Jeremiah Crow, but the cabin stayed, and so did the screeching.